I grew up thinking I'd always be a part of the family business. It's what my uncle had promised me from the time I was old enough to understand the world around me. As a kid, I spent every summer in his office, watching him handle contracts, negotiate deals, and build something out of nothing. It wasn't just a business to me, it was family history, legacy, and pride all rolled into one. The business had started small. My grandfather founded it when he was still fresh from the Navy, wanting to build a better life for his family. It was just a tiny construction company then. But it grew, year by year, and by the time my uncle took over, it was a thriving operation with more employees than I could count and contracts in cities all across the state. I was proud to be a part of it, proud to know I was following in the footsteps of men who had built something lasting. But that's where my uncle's promises to me started to crack. It was always my dream to one day stand alongside him, as a partner, not just some employee. We'd talked about it for years, joked even, one day, kid, this will be yours and mine. Together, we'll take this business to new heights, he'd say, usually with a rough clap on my back and a grin as wide as the sky. I believed him. I worked for it. I started as a teenager doing grunt work, sweeping floors, organizing tools, fetching coffee, anything to show him I was willing to start from the bottom. Just like he had. By the time I was 25, I had a degree in business management, had learned the ins and outs of construction, and had been running several major projects for the company. I thought I was next in line. But then my cousin, Bobby, came along. Bobby wasn't exactly what you'd call a hard worker. He was the kind of guy who skated through life, relying on charm, not hustle. He was a smooth talker, sure, and people liked him. But in the business world, you needed more than a nice smile and a few jokes to succeed. Bobby never worked for the company a day in his life. Not until about 6 months ago when my uncle decided to show him the ropes. It didn't take long to see the writing on the wall. My uncle had a soft spot for Bobby. No doubt because Bobby was his only son. The legacy he'd always envisioned. It didn't matter that I'd spent years proving myself, that I'd earned my place in the company. To my uncle, blood was thicker than anything else. He wanted Bobby to inherit the business. And the more time passed, the clearer it became that I wasn't going to be part of that future. The final blow came one Friday afternoon when my uncle called me into his office. I'd been running a project downtown, one of the biggest we'd ever taken on, and I was excited to update him on how smoothly everything was going. But as soon as I walked into the room, I knew something was off. My uncle was sitting at his desk, his eyes downcast, and Bobby was lounging on the couch with that smirk of his. "Come in, kid, sit down," my uncle said, waving me toward a chair. I didn't like the tone of his voice. It was too soft, too careful. I sat, glancing between the two of them. Bobby didn't say anything. He just watched, waiting. "We need to talk about the future," my uncle started, and my stomach dropped. I knew what was coming, but I didn't want to believe it. Not yet. "I've been thinking about the company, about where it's headed, and who's going to be part of that vision," he continued. His eyes finally met mine, but there wasn't the usual warmth in them. "And I think it's time I make some decisions." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "What kind of decisions?" My uncle shifted in his chair. "You've done great work here. No doubt about that. You've been loyal, and I appreciate everything you've put into the business." He paused, looking away. "But Bobby, he's my son. You understand that, don't you?" I felt a lump forming in my throat. "I understand," I said, though my voice was barely a whisper. "I've decided to make Bobby my partner." There it was, the words I'd been dreading for months. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clenched my fists in my lap, struggling to keep my composure. "You've got to be kidding me," I finally managed, my voice low but firm. "Bobby, he's barely worked here 6 months. He doesn't know anything about running a company like this." Bobby raised an eyebrow, but still said nothing, letting my uncle handle the conversation. "I know this is hard to hear," my uncle said, leaning forward slightly, "but Bobby's my blood. I've got to think about the future of this company. And that means keeping it in the family." "I am family," I snapped before I could stop myself. "I've worked my whole life for this." "You said." "I know what I said," my uncle interrupted, holding up a hand, "and I meant it, at the time. But things change." "Things change," I repeated, incredulous. "So what happens to me? You're just pushing me aside." He sighed. "I'm not pushing you aside. I want you to stay on. Help Bobby transition into his role. You'll still be an important part of the company. But I need you to understand that Bobby is the future." I sat there, stunned, as the reality of what he was saying sank in. My uncle wasn't just asking me to step aside. He was asking me to help Bobby take over everything I'd worked for. Everything I'd earned. And for what? Because Bobby was his son. I can't believe this, I muttered, shaking my head. I've given you everything. I've busted my ass for this company. For you. And this is how you repay me. My uncle's expression hardened. It's not about repayment. It's about family. Blood. You've always known that. I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. I guess I never really understood what family meant to you. Before he could respond, I turned and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind me. I didn't even look back at Bobby. I didn't care to see the smug look I knew would be plastered on his face. The next few days were a blur. I avoided the office, not sure what to do with myself. Anger simmered beneath the surface. But more than that, I felt betrayed. My uncle had promised me a future, and now he was taking it all away because of some twisted notion of loyalty to his son. I couldn't stand the thought of working under Bobby, of taking orders from him when I knew more about the business in my sleep than he did on his best day. By the time Monday rolled around, I knew I had a decision to make. I could either stay and let my uncle walk all over me, or I could walk away. Neither option felt good. Staying meant swallowing my pride and accepting that I'd never be more than a second-tier employee. Leaving meant giving up on everything I'd worked for, everything my grandfather had built. But in the end, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stay, not like this. I walked into the office that morning, my heart pounding, and headed straight for my uncle's door. I didn't knock, I just pushed it open and stepped inside. He looked up, surprised to see me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. He gestured to the chair, but I shook my head. "I won't be staying long." My uncle leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "What's this about?" "I've thought about your offer," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on him, "and I've decided I can't accept it." He raised an eyebrow. "You're leaving?" I nodded. "I am. I won't be staying on to help Bobby. And I won't be sticking around to watch him run this company into the ground." My uncle's expression darkened. "That's a bit harsh, don't you think?" "Harsh," I repeated. "You want me to work for someone who has no idea what he's doing? Who hasn't earned any of this? I've earned my place here, but you've made it clear that doesn't matter to you. So yeah, I'm leaving." He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me, his jaw tight. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, it's what I need," I said. "I'll be out by the end of the week." With that, I turned and walked out of his office for the last time, feeling a strange mix of anger, relief, and sadness wash over me. This wasn't how I'd imagined things would end, but maybe it was for the best. As I left the building, I couldn't help but think about my grandfather, about the legacy he'd built and what it had meant to him. I wasn't sure where I'd go from here, but one thing was certain: I'd build something of my own. Just like he had, something that no one could take away from me. I spent the next few days packing up my things, tying up loose ends, and saying quiet goodbyes to the few people in the office I still respected. No one asked me why I was leaving, they all knew. Word spread fast in a family business, and the tension between me and my uncle had become impossible to hide. I could feel their pitying glances as I walked through the halls for the last time. But I didn't care. I wasn't looking for sympathy. When Friday came, I packed the last box into my truck and took one final look at the building. It didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't home. I'd poured my heart and soul into the company. And for what? To be overlooked in favor of someone who hadn't put in half the effort. The bitterness was still there, but so was something else, a sense of freedom. I didn't have to stay where I wasn't appreciated. I could make my own path, even if that meant starting from scratch. I drove to the outskirts of town and parked by the lake where I used to go fishing with my grandfather. The water was calm, reflecting the fading afternoon sun, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. I sat on the hood of my truck and stared out at the horizon, thinking about what was next. I didn't have a concrete plan yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let this define me. I wasn't going to let my uncle's betrayal be the end of my story. I pulled out my phone and opened an email draft I'd been working on all week. It was a proposal to a rival construction company, one that had been trying to poach me for months. I hadn't been ready to leave back then, still holding on to the hope that my uncle would keep his word. But now, it was time to move on. I hit send, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. I had no idea if they'd bite or if I'd end up somewhere else entirely. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was taking control of my life again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in my head. "Build something of your own, kid, something that lasts." I smiled to myself. He was right. I built something better than what my uncle had to offer, something stronger. Something mine. And this time, no one was going to take it away from me.